442,000 acres. It is a number so large it slides right past comprehension, a figure that the mind receives and then quietly sets aside because it has no shelf to put it on, so let us slow it down and try to actually see it. 442,000 acres is nearly 700 square miles of the American West on fire. An area larger than some of the nation's biggest cities, a burn scar that would swallow entire metropolitan regions whole, that would blanket a good-sized county from one line to the other, that a person could not cross on foot in a single day of hard walking. It is a fire so vast that a person standing at one edge of it could not see the other side, could not drive across it quickly, could not grasp its full extent from any single vantage point on the ground. And right now, along the high desert country where Oregon meets Idaho, that is exactly the fire that is burning. The Big Grass Fire has topped 442,000 acres, making it the largest wildfire currently burning anywhere in the United States, a monster of the sagebrush sea straddling a state line. And its story is one that reveals something crucial and widely misunderstood about how the American West actually burns. Because here is the thing that surprises people most about a fire this enormous. It is not primarily a forest fire. The name says it. Big grass. This is a fire burning through grass and sagebrush and the wide-open rangelands of the high desert, the vast, treeless country of the Great Basin that stretches across the Oregon-Idaho border. And that single fact, that the largest fire in the country is burning, not through towering timber but through grass and brush, is the key to understanding how it grew so staggeringly large so fast, why these rangeland fires have become some of the biggest in the nation year after year, and why the story of the Big Grass Fire is really the story of a landscape that has been quietly transformed into some of the most flammable terrain on the continent. The fire that burns like a fuse. To understand the Big Grass Fire, you have to abandon the mental image most people carry of what a wildfire is. When we hear the word wildfire, we tend to picture a wall of flame roaring through a dense forest, consuming towering trees, throwing embers high into a smoke-black sky. That is one kind of wildfire, and it is real and destructive. But it is not this kind. A grass and sagebrush fire behaves according to an entirely different set of rules, and those rules are exactly what allow it to grow to 442,000 acres. The defining characteristic of grass as a fuel is that it is fine and flashy. A blade of dried grass has almost no mass and holds almost no moisture once it cures in the summer heat. This means it ignites in an instant and burns through in seconds, but more importantly, it means fire moves through it with astonishing speed. Where a forest fire might advance slowly as it works to ignite heavy logs and thick trunks, a grass fire races across the landscape like a fuse, driven forward by the wind, covering ground at a rate that can outpace almost anything. A grass fire does not smolder and build, it runs. Under the right conditions, dry fuel, low humidity, and above all wind, a grass fire can spread across tens of thousands of acres in a single day, sweeping over the open country faster than crews can hope to get ahead of it. This is why the biggest fires by sheer acreage in the United States are so often not the forest fires of the mountains, but the rangeland fires of the Great Basin and the plains. Grass burns fast, and fast is how you get big. The sagebrush that dots this landscape adds another dimension to the fire. Sagebrush and the other desert shrubs contain oils and fine woody material that burn hot and intense, adding bursts of heat and flame to the fast-moving front of grass fire. When a grass fire hits a stand of sagebrush, the intensity spikes, throwing embers ahead into fresh fuel and driving the fire onward. The combination, a continuous carpet of fine, cured grass, punctuated by oily, flammable brush, creates a fuel bed almost perfectly designed to carry a large, fast fire across enormous distances. And that is exactly what the country along the Oregon-Idaho line provides, mile after mile after mile of it, an unbroken expanse of flammable rangeland stretching to the horizon in every direction. The terrain of the sagebrush sea, the high desert of the Oregon-Idaho borderlands, is a landscape that many Americans have never seen and cannot quite picture. It is not the dramatic desert of towering red rock and saguaro cactus. It is something more subtle and, in its own way, more vast. The sagebrush steppe, an ocean of silver-green brush and pale grass rolling across an immense, sparsely populated country, broken by rimrock canyons, dry washes, and long open basins. This is the Great Basin, the high desert heart of the American West, and it is one of the largest and least understood ecosystems on the continent. It is also enormous and empty in a way that shapes everything about how a fire like the Big Grass Fire behaves and how it is fought. This is country where you can drive for an hour and see no town, no house, few if any people. The roads are few and often unpaved. The terrain, while not as steep as the mountains, is cut by canyons and rimrock that channel the wind and block access. And critically, the fuel is continuous. There are no natural fire breaks to speak of across much of this landscape, no wide rivers, no rock barrens. No breaks in the vegetation to stop a fire's advance. Once a fire gets running across the sagebrush sea, there is little in the natural landscape to slow it down. It can burn across a distance that in more fragmented country would be interrupted a dozen times over, but here just keeps going, feeding on the endless carpet of grass and brush. This vastness and emptiness cuts two ways when it comes to the danger the fire poses. On one hand, the sparse population means that a fire of 442,000 acres can burn without directly threatening large numbers of homes and people in the way a fire of that size would in more developed country. This is not a fire chewing through dense suburbs. On the other hand, that same emptiness is precisely what allows the fire to grow so large, because there is so much unbroken fuel and so little to stop it, and the remoteness makes it far harder to fight, with crews forced to travel long distances over poor roads to reach a fire front that may be moving faster than they can respond. The Sagebrush Sea is a place built almost to produce enormous fires, and the Big Grass Fire is what that place produces when the conditions align. What really lies in the path it would be a mistake, though, to conclude that because this country is sparsely populated, a fire of this magnitude does little harm. The damage a rangeland fire inflicts is real and severe. It is simply different from the damage of a forest fire tearing through a mountain town, and understanding what is actually at stake requires looking at what this landscape holds and who depends on it. First and most immediately, there are the ranching communities and the livelihoods built on this land. The high desert of the Oregon-Idaho border is ranching country, where cattle graze across the vast open rangelands and where families have made their living off this land for generations. A fire of this size can be catastrophic for them. It can burn across the grazing lands that feed the herds, destroy the forage that livestock depend on, consume fences and outbuildings and equipment, threaten ranch structures and homes scattered across the country, and in the worst cases kill livestock caught in the fire's path. For a ranching family, the loss of the range to fire can mean the loss of the very foundation of their operation, forcing them to sell off cattle they can no longer feed or to buy expensive hay to replace the grass that burned. The economic blow to these rural communities, though it may not make national headlines, can be devastating and long-lasting. Then there is the ecological toll, which in the sagebrush steppe is uniquely severe and points to one of the deepest tragedies of these fires. The sagebrush ecosystem is home to a range of wildlife specially adapted to it, species that depend on the sagebrush itself for food and shelter and survival. And here is the cruel irony. Unlike some ecosystems that evolved with frequent fire and bounce back quickly, the sagebrush steppe is not well adapted to burning. Sagebrush is slow growing and does not resprout readily after fire. It can take many years, sometimes decades, for a burned sagebrush landscape to recover its mature brush. When a fire like the Big Grass Fire sweeps through, it can destroy vast areas of this habitat in a matter of days, habitat that will take a human generation or more to return, if it returns at all. For the wildlife that depends on intact sagebrush, a fire of this scale is not a natural renewal, but a genuine catastrophe, wiping out the very habitat they cannot live without. The loss of hundreds of thousands of acres of sagebrush is an ecological wound that the landscape may carry for a very long time. And there is the smoke, which respects no boundaries and no population maps. A fire of 442,000 acres produces an immense volume of smoke, and that smoke drifts far beyond the empty country where the fire burns, settling over towns and cities across the region, degrading air quality, and posing a health hazard to people who may be hundreds of miles from the nearest flame. Wildfire smoke carries fine particulate matter that lodges deep in the lungs, aggravating asthma and heart conditions and endangering the vulnerable. A fire in the remote sagebrush sea can foul the air over distant communities for days. A reminder that even a fire burning in one of the emptiest corners of the country reaches out to touch far more people than live anywhere near it. The invasive grass that changed everything here, we arrive at the deepest and most important part of the story. The piece that transforms the big grass fire from a simple natural event into a symptom of a profound and human-caused transformation of the Western landscape. Because the very fact that this country now carries such enormous, fast-moving fires is not entirely natural. It is, in large part, the result of an ecological invasion that has quietly remade the sagebrush steppe over the past century, turning it into some of the most fire-prone land in North America. The culprit is invasive annual grasses, above all a species called cheatgrass, along with others like medusa head. These grasses are not native to the American West. They arrive from elsewhere, and over the past 100+ years they have spread across enormous swaths of the Great Basin, colonizing the ground between and beneath the native sagebrush and bunchgrasses. And they have transformed the landscape in a way that is almost perfectly designed to produce more and bigger fires. The native sagebrush ecosystem, in its intact form, had a certain patchiness to it, bare ground between the shrubs, native bunchgrasses that stayed greener longer, a landscape that did not carry fire easily or continuously. The invasive annual grasses changed all of that. They fill in the bare ground, creating a continuous carpet of fine fuel where before there were gaps. They cure early in the season, drying out into flammable tinder while the native plants are still green, and they blanket the landscape in exactly the kind of fast-burning fuel that carries large fires across great distances. The result is a vicious cycle that ecologists have watched with alarm, and it is the engine behind fires like the big grass fire. The invasive grasses make fires more frequent and more intense. Those fires, in turn, kill off the native sagebrush and bunchgrasses, which are not adapted to frequent burning. And into the burned ground, the invasive grasses move even faster. Because they thrive on disturbance and recolonize a burn scar far more quickly than the slow-growing native plants can. So each fire makes the land more dominated by invasive grass, and more invasive grass makes the next fire more likely and more severe. It is a self-reinforcing loop, a feedback cycle in which fire begets grass and grass begets fire, and with each turn of the cycle, more of the native sagebrush steppe is converted into flammable invasive grassland. Vast areas of the Great Basin have already crossed this threshold, transformed from diverse native shrubland into monotonous, fire-prone stands of cheatgrass. The big grass fire is burning across a landscape that this invasion has primed to burn, and it is, in a sense, both a product of that transformation and an agent driving it further. This is why fires of this staggering size have become a recurring feature of the Great Basin, year after year. It is not simply that the West has always had big grass fires. It is that the landscape itself has been changed, loaded with invasive fuel, turned into a tinderbox on a scale the native ecosystem never was. The big grass fire's 442,000 acres are a measure not only of this year's weather, but of a century of ecological change that has made the sagebrush sea into some of the most combustible country on the continent. The weather that lights the match, if the invasive grasses are the loaded gun, then the weather is the finger on the trigger. And the conditions across the West during fire season are exactly what turn a primed landscape into a 400,000-acre inferno. A fire of this magnitude does not happen in isolation. It happens when the fuel and the atmosphere align to produce fire behavior that overwhelms any possibility of quick control. The first ingredient is heat and drought. The high desert bakes through the summer, with temperatures climbing high and the air growing bone dry. The fine grasses, already cured, lose even their trace moisture in that furnace air, and the humidity drops into the single digits, creating conditions where any ignition can catch and spread. The broader drought that has gripped much of the West only deepens this, leaving the entire landscape parched and primed. The second and most critical ingredient is wind. Wind is the great accelerant of grass fires, and the open country of the Sagebrush Sea offers nothing to slow it. When strong winds sweep across the high desert, they drive a grass fire forward at tremendous speed, pushing the flame front across the landscape, hurling embers ahead to start new fires, and making the fire's advance nearly impossible to stop or even predict. A grass fire under strong wind can run for miles and hours, and it is precisely these wind-driven runs that add tens of thousands of acres to a fire in a single afternoon, building the enormous totals that fires like the big grass reach. And a fire this large begins, in its own way, to influence the air around it. The immense heat rising off a fire of this scale can generate its own local winds and erratic behavior, drawing in air at the surface and creating shifting, unpredictable conditions along the fire's edge. While a grass fire may not build the towering pyrocumulus clouds of a great forest fire in the same way, the sheer scale of a 400,000-acre burn creates its own volatile environment, adding another layer of danger and unpredictability for the crews trying to work its flanks. Between the primed fuel, the heat, the drought, and above all the wind, the conditions across the Oregon-Idaho line have produced exactly the recipe for a fire of historic size, and the big grass fire is the result. How you fight a fire this big. Confronting a fire of 442,000 acres in remote high desert country is a challenge that tests the limits of the nation's firefighting capacity, and the way such a fire is fought is different in important ways from battling a fire in the forested mountains. Understanding the response reveals both the scale of the effort and the hard realities that shape what is even possible against a fire this size. The response to a large fire is organized under the Incident Command System, a scalable management structure that can grow to coordinate hundreds or thousands of personnel across a sprawling fire. An incident management team takes over the operation, dividing the vast fire into geographic sections, each with its own crews and objectives, and setting priorities in a fixed order. Protect human life first, then protect structures and critical values, then work to contain the fire itself. On a rangeland fire, some of the tools differ from those used in the forest. The open terrain, for all its challenges, allows for the use of engines and, crucially, heavy equipment, bulldozers and graders that can cut wide fire lines through the grass and brush, scraping the fuel down to bare dirt to create a barrier the fire cannot cross. Because grass fires are driven so heavily by wind and spread along the surface, these plowed or scraped lines, combined with natural features and existing roads, are a central tactic, and firefighters work to widen roads and two tracks into defensible lines, and to burn out the fuel between a line and the advancing fire to rob it of anything to consume. Aircraft play their part as well, with air tankers dropping retardant to slow the fire's runs and helicopters delivering water where they can. Though in the vast open country the aircraft face the same challenge as everyone else, the fire is simply enormous, and the flame front may stretch for many miles, and this points to the hard truth about fighting a fire of this scale. With a flame front that can extend for tens of miles across roadless country, driven by wind across continuous fuel, there is often no possibility of simply stopping the fire everywhere at once. The crews cannot be everywhere. Instead, much of the strategy becomes about steering the fire, protecting the specific values in its path. The ranches, the structures, the critical infrastructure, building line where it can be held, and waiting for the conditions to change. Because in the end, a fire this large in this kind of country is very often brought under control, not by direct human effort alone, but by a shift in the weather, a drop in the wind, a rise in humidity, a change in the pattern that finally gives the firefighters the opening they need. Until that shift comes, the enormous fire runs largely on its own terms, and the firefighters do what they can to blunt its worst effects and protect what matters most in its path. The remoteness compounds every one of these challenges. Crews and equipment must travel long distances over poor roads to reach the fire. Supply lines stretch across empty country. Water sources are scarce in the desert, complicating the work of engines and helicopters alike. And the same national pool of firefighting resources, the crews, the aircraft, the overhead teams, that this fire draws on is being drawn on by every other large fire burning across the West at the same time. so that a remote rangeland fire, even the largest in the country, must compete for resources with fires that may pose a more direct threat to towns and lives. All of this shapes a response that is necessarily focused, pragmatic, and realistic about what can and cannot be achieved against a fire of this magnitude. The people who fight the sagebrush see it as easy, contemplating a fire measured in the hundreds of thousands of acres, to lose sight of the human beings who put themselves between it and everything in its path. And the people who fight a fire like the big grass fire deserve to be understood, because their work is hard and dangerous in ways particular to this country. Fighting fire in the remote high desert is a grueling, exhausting undertaking carried out far from the comforts of anywhere, in searing heat, choking dust, and thick smoke across a landscape that offers little shelter and less water. There is a persistent myth that a grass fire is somehow safer or easier to fight than a forest fire, that flames only a few feet high and the brush posed little threat. Nothing could be more dangerous a misconception. Grass fires kill firefighters. Their very speed is what makes them so lethal, because a wind-driven grass fire can change direction and overrun a position faster than a person can react or a vehicle can escape. A shift in the wind can turn a fire that was moving safely away into one racing toward the crew in a matter of moments, and in open country with fuel all around, there may be nowhere to go. The history of wildland firefighting includes tragic losses on exactly these kinds of fast-moving grass and brush fires, where the flame front simply moved faster than anyone anticipated. The firefighters who work the big grass fire understand this danger intimately, and it shapes every decision they make, pushing them toward caution, toward keeping escape routes open, toward refusing to commit to positions they cannot safely hold. The relatively short flames of a grass fire hide a genuine capacity to kill, and respecting that capacity is a matter of survival. The work itself falls to a mix of forces that reflects the patchwork of who manages this land. Federal firefighters, whose agencies oversee vast tracts of the public rangeland, form much of the backbone of the response. Alongside them, work state crews, local rural fire departments, and, in a tradition especially strong in ranching country, the ranchers themselves, who often turn out with their own equipment to fight fire on and around their land, plowing lines with tractors and knocking down flames to protect their range and their neighbors. This blend of professional firefighters and local people defending their own country is a distinctive feature of rangeland fire, born of the remoteness and the enormous distances involved, and it speaks to how deeply these fires threaten the communities that live scattered across the high desert. When a fire this size runs across the sagebrush sea, it calls out not only the national firefighting apparatus, but the people of the land themselves, all of them working together against a fire far larger than any of them. Why the biggest fires are grass fires is worth stepping back to absorb a fact that the big grass fire drives home, and that runs counter to most people's intuition, year after year. Some of the very largest wildfires in the United States by acreage are not the forest fires that dominate the news, but rangeland grass fires in the Great Basin and the plains. The big grass fire, topping 442,000 acres to become the largest fire currently burning in the nation, is not an anomaly. It is part of a well-established pattern, and understanding that pattern reframes how we think about wildfire in America. The forest fires of the mountains and the coast tend to capture the public imagination and the headlines because they threaten well-known communities, produce dramatic walls of flame, and often destroy large numbers of homes. Those fires are genuinely destructive and deserve the attention they receive. But when it comes to sheer size, to the number of acres burned, it is frequently the grass and brush fires of the open country that top the list. This is a direct consequence of everything we have discussed. Grass burns fast, the rangelands offer vast, continuous, unbroken fuel, the country is open to the wind. And the invasive grass invasion has primed enormous areas to carry huge fires. A fire in continuous grass under wind can cover in a day what a forest fire might take a week or more to burn, and in the empty expanses of the Great Basin, there is little to stop it from running for hundreds of thousands of acres. So the biggest numbers, the truly staggering acreages, tend to come from exactly these fires, the ones burning through the sagebrush sea, far from the cities, in country most Americans never see. This pattern matters because it shapes how we ought to understand and respond to the wildfire crisis. If our entire mental model of wildfire is the forest fire threatening a mountain town, we miss half the picture. The vast rangeland fires that burn the most acreage, that devastate ranching economies and irreplaceable sagebrush habitat, that are driven by an ecological transformation most people have never heard of. The Big Grass Fire is a reminder that the story of fire in the American West is not only a story of forests, it is also, and perhaps even more so, in terms of sheer scale, a story of grass, of a high desert landscape remade into a tinderbox, burning on a scale that dwarfs the fires we hear the most about. The aftermath that outlasts the flames when a fire like the Big Grass Fire finally dies down, the crisis does not end. In many ways, a slower and longer crisis is only beginning, and the aftermath of a rangeland fire of this scale carries dangers and consequences that unfold for months and years after the last flame is out. Understanding what comes after the fire is essential to grasping its full toll. The most immediate danger in the aftermath is what happens when the rains come to burn ground. A landscape stripped of its vegetation by fire loses the plants and roots that once held the soil in place and slowed the movement of water across the land. When rain falls on that bare, scorched ground, and in the high desert, summer storms can bring sudden, intense downpours. The water runs off far faster than it would over healthy land, and it carries the loosened soil and ash with it. This can produce flash floods and debris flows, sudden torrents of muddy water and sediment that surge down the drainages and washes, capable of damaging roads, infrastructure, and any structures in their path, and of degrading the streams and water sources that both wildlife and ranching depend on. A fire scar is a hazard long after it cools, and the communities and lands downstream of a large burn must brace for the possibility that the next rains will bring flooding and erosion that the fire set up. Then there is the long ecological reckoning, which in the sagebrush steppe is measured not in seasons, but in decades. The recovery of a burned landscape is never guaranteed, and in this ecosystem it is especially fraught because of the invasive grass cycle already described. When the native sagebrush and bunchgrasses burn, they recover slowly, if at all, while the invasive annual grasses rush back into the disturbed ground, often faster and more aggressively than before. This means that the burned country may recover not as the diverse native shrubland it once was, but as an even more invasive-dominated, even more flammable grassland, primed for the next fire. Left to its own devices, a large burn in this landscape can represent not a temporary setback, but a permanent conversion, a step down the ladder from native ecosystem toward degraded grassland. This is why the aftermath of the Big Grass Fire will demand active effort, reseeding with native plants, treating the invasive grasses, managing the land to give the natives a chance. If the burned country is to have any hope of recovering its former character rather than sliding further into the invasive cycle, that work is difficult, expensive, and uncertain, spread across an enormous area, and its success is far from assured. For the ranching communities, the aftermath means hard practical decisions and long recovery. The range that burned will not be available for grazing for a season or more, sometimes much longer, forcing ranchers to find and pay for alternative feed or to reduce their herds. Fences and infrastructure must be rebuilt. The land must be nursed back toward productivity. And there is the emotional toll of watching country that families have stewarded for generations transformed in a matter of days, its future thrown into uncertainty. The recovery of a ranching operation after a major range fire can take years, and some may never fully recover at all. The 442,000 acres of the Big Grass Fire, then, are not a wound that heals quickly. They are the beginning of a long and uncertain process of recovery, one whose outcome will shape this country for a generation to come. What the Big Grass Fire is telling us. Step back from the flames and the acreage and the smoke, and the Big Grass Fire becomes something more than a single dramatic event on the Oregon-Idaho line. It becomes a message, a signal about the state of an entire ecosystem and the trajectory it is on, and the message is a sobering one that reaches far beyond this one fire in this one summer. What the fire is telling us is that a vast and vital region of the American West has been transformed into a landscape primed for enormous fire, and that the transformation is accelerating. The combination of the invasive grass invasion, the warming and drying climate, and the self-reinforcing cycle of fire and grass has pushed the sagebrush steppe into a new and dangerous regime, one in which fires of hundreds of thousands of acres are not rare catastrophes, but recurring features of the landscape. Each fire, like the big grass fire, advances the transformation, converting more native shrubland into flammable invasive grassland, ensuring that the next fire will find even more fuel waiting. The sagebrush sea, one of the great ecosystems of the continent and the home of wildlife found nowhere else, is being steadily converted, fire by fire, into something else, a more monotonous, more flammable, less diverse grassland, its native character burning away a few 100,000 acres at a time. This is a slow-motion crisis that unfolds largely out of sight. In the empty country that most Americans never visit and rarely think about, it does not produce the dramatic urban destruction that draws the cameras, and so it proceeds with far less attention than it deserves. There is a quiet unfairness in that neglect, because the sagebrush steppe is not empty in any meaningful sense. It is one of the largest intact ecosystems left in the lower 48 states, a stronghold for species that exist nowhere else on Earth, and a working landscape that sustains a way of life stretching back generations. That it can burn on a scale of hundreds of thousands of acres and still be treated as a footnote, overshadowed by smaller but more visible fires elsewhere, says a great deal about how we decide which losses count and which are allowed to happen unremarked. The big grass fire challenges that indifference simply by its size, forcing a moment of attention onto a corner of the country that usually receives none, and asking whether we will keep looking away as one of the West's great landscapes burns and transforms a little more with every passing season. But its consequences are profound: the loss of irreplaceable habitat, the devastation of ranching communities, the fouling of the region's air, and the steady degradation of one of the West's largest natural landscapes. The big grass fire, in all its staggering size, is both a symptom of this transformation and an engine driving it forward. And its 442,000 acres are a measure of just how far the process has already gone. There are efforts to fight back against this trajectory, work to control the invasive grasses, to restore native vegetation, to create fuel breaks across the landscape that can help contain future fires, to manage the rangelands in ways that build resilience rather than flammability. Land managers have experimented with strategic networks of fuel breaks along roads and ridgelines, places where the continuous carpet of grass is deliberately interrupted so that firefighters have somewhere to make a stand and stop a fire's headlong run before it reaches the scale of the big grass fire. There is targeted grazing, using livestock to eat down the invasive grasses before they cure into tinder, and there is the painstaking work of reseeding burned ground with native plants in a race against the invaders. These efforts matter, and they represent a recognition that the current path is not sustainable. But they are working against powerful forces, a changing climate, an entrenched invasion, and a fire cycle that feeds on itself, and the scale of the challenge is immense, spread across a landscape so vast that any single intervention is a drop against an ocean of flammable grass. The math is daunting. The invasion covers tens of millions of acres, and the resources to fight it are a fraction of what the full scale of the problem would demand. Whether the West can find a way to break the cycle, to slow the transformation of the sagebrush sea before it is complete, remains one of the great open questions of Western land management, and fires like the big grass are the stark measure of how much is riding on the answer. For now, the big grass fire burns on along the Oregon-Idaho line, the largest wildfire in the country. A monster of grass and sagebrush and wind sweeping across the high desert. The crews will work its flanks, protect the ranches and structures in its path, hold what lines they can, and wait for the weather to turn. The smoke will drift over distant towns. The sagebrush and the wildlife that depend on it will pay a price that will take a generation to reckon. And when the fire is finally out, the burned country will begin its slow recovery. A recovery that in this transformed landscape may bring back not the native sagebrush sea, but yet more of the invasive grass that will feed the fires still to come. That is the deeper story of the Big Grass Fire, written across nearly 700 square miles of the American West, a landscape remade by an invasion most people have never heard of. A cycle accelerating with every fire, and a warning burning bright along a remote state line about the future of fire in the high desert country. It is a story that will keep being written summer after summer and fire after fire, in the smoke rising over the sagebrush sea, whether or not the rest of the country ever chooses to stop and read it. And the sheer size of this one, the largest fire burning anywhere in the nation right now, is simply the loudest that the warning has yet been